Wszystko zaczęło się od króla Jagiełły. Mała Łodzia stała się miastem, które w XIX wieku rozwijało się najszybciej na świecie. W ciągu zaledwie 60 lat od powstania pierwszej manufaktury powstaje przemysłowa, wielonarodowościowa metropolia. Jednak wiatry historii nie zawsze jej sprzyjały. To, co zniszczył los, odbudowują łodzianie. Nasza Łódź. Miasto wielkich szans. Od 600 lat w sercu Polski i Europy.
Jesteśmy Polakami. Jesteśmy niezwykłym społeczeństwem. Zawsze w obliczu wielkiego wyzwania potrafimy się mobilizować. Potrafimy stawić czoła wielkim wyzwaniom. Bo nie potrafimy stać obojętnie. Bo obchodzi nas bezpieczeństwo i przyszłość naszych dzieci. Bo wierzymy, że nadzieja zwycięża apatię, lęk i strach. Bo mimo wszelkich przeciwności nigdy się nie poddajemy. Potrafimy ciężko pracować, wspierać się i działać razem. Bo zależy nam na naszej ojczyźnie, naszym osiedlu, naszej ulicy. Bo chcemy naszych niezbywalnych praw i wolności. Bo nie oddamy naszych marzeń. Nadchodzi punkt zwrotny.
Dear guests, let me start this discussion by introducing myself and our speakers today. My name is Ayvazyan. I'm going to moderate this discussion. I'm a senior project manager working for Friedrich Naumann Foundation, Russia and Central Asia office in Exile, currently based in Tbilisi. And today with me, and I want to excuse myself for making possible mistakes in pronouncing surnames, which is always a struggle, and I know how uncomfortable it might be as a person with a difficult surname myself. So we have, and I'll go from the left side, Erik Uszkiewicz from Hungary, human rights expert and researcher, Franak Viačorka from Belarus, political activist and researcher too, David Koranyi from Action for Democracy organization, and Piotr Kwapisiewicz, minority rights experts. And first of all, I just want to refer to the story behind this event. It started from a joint project between two FNF offices and Institut Novum organization in Slovenia, and the director of which, Sebastian Pikel, is just sitting in front of me. And we actually published a publication about human rights in Central and Eastern Europe. There we have contributions from authors from all over the region, not only from Central Europe, Hungary, Poland, but also from Armenia, Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. The point in bringing together people from all these countries was to try to reconsider the human rights discourse and actually see if the challenges we face are common, and if there is something that the international human rights community can come up to help each other in our work. Because no matter how pessimistic we might be about what is happening in our countries, human rights work is a day-to-day work connected to to everyday effort. Monitoring laws, law enforcement, because human rights activists and lawyers work in very adverse circumstances, but they still work in all the countries. As our mission, FNF sees the goal of promoting freedom not only within the European Union, but also across European borders. And we work in many countries that are not members of the EU. And as FNF, we see our goal also in connecting people who share liberal values, and providing platform for dialogue. And to start today's discussion, I would like to address Franak Viačorka. And actually, I would ask all the participants to be rather pragmatic. Preparing for this discussion, I asked all the participants to answer the question what the human rights community might have overlooked in last decade, because if you read contributions in our publication, in many other publications on human rights, you can actually observe that the downward trend was there many years ago. And it's what we observe nowadays is not something that happened in a day. It's something that was deteriorating in decades. And the question is, what might have been done differently? What the European community needs to pay more attention to? And I admire Belarusian people for their courage, because this is a country that you can face death penalty for your political position. And how do you fight for freedom in this situation? And is there any practical consideration you can give to the international community? What can be done?
Good morning, and thank you so much for introduction. It's hard, you asked to be pragmatic, but usually human rights defense and freedom fight is done by romantics, not by pragmatics, because it's pragmatical to think about security and pragmatical to think about economical success, but people who are working in this sphere, our sphere, they need a lot of passion and energy, because you always are challenged not just by dictators, but also by rules and also by democratic politicians who don't prioritize the thing you are doing. I am from Belarus. I work as a chief of staff for Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Before I was a journalist, before I was an activist. I was in prisons many times. My freedom fight started when I was 13 years old, when I was first time detained. And what I feel that there is a normalization of repressions, normalization of human rights violations. When I was 13, when I was arrested for the first time, they kept me for 3 hours. And that was the maximum punishment I could get. Right now, for the same thing, for spreading leaflets or drawing a political sign on the wall in Belarus, I will get from 8 to 12 years. So basically, we see the normalization of repressions, and dictators, they see there is no strong response for violations of human rights, and they increase the stakes. It happens in Belarus, it happens in Iran, it happens in Azerbaijan, it happens all over the world. And of course, we see what Putin is doing in Ukraine, when hundreds and thousands of people are died and killed every day, and they become just statistics. So regarding your question, I think prioritization of human rights is number one task, because we see that when security issues become important, human rights are put somewhere in the back. And it happens with, for example, when Lukashenko started orchestrated migration crisis, the thing with human rights was immediately forgotten. When Putin started the war, and the issue was to protect the borders, also the human rights in Belarus became forgotten. We see how Belarus, with a huge humanitarian catastrophe, is being overshadowed right now. Second, we need collaboration to defend human rights and freedoms with different actors. Only NGOs cannot do that. Only like Amnesty, Libereco, Naumann foundations and many others cannot do it alone. We need allies with governments, and also we need allies with tech companies, which are playing very important role right now, sometimes even bigger than governments. but they are not always on the side of human rights defenders and victims of repressions. We see that in Belarus, for example, tech companies are often too late in responding. Lukashenko is placing, when people are being detained and interrogated by KGB, later they record the videos, confessional videos of beaten people. They put this video on YouTube and advertise this video. And for us, we are thankful to Google because they started to block such videos. But many other platforms are not doing that. And TikTok is full of KGB recorded videos with beaten and tortured people. And my last point, I know I'm too long, the Belarus is a very good example how the neglection of human rights by international community could expand, could develop. It becomes not just domestic internal matter, it became the regional and global issue. And we see how from 2020 crackdown, the crisis evolved into the war, evolved into something that Europe is paying so much right now. And in order to not create such precedents in other parts of the world, it's very important to address such issues when they appear, when rights are violated immediately.
Thank you so much, Franak. I would like to ask a question to David. David, your organization, Action for Democracy, states its mission as making local problems heard globally. That's what I read. Could you speak a bit more what you do exactly and why you think it's important?
Sure. Thank you, Anna. With pleasure. And thank you to the organizers for having me. It's my first time in Łódź, and it's a wonderful city, and I'm really enjoying it so far, even though, unfortunately, my stay is going to be relatively short. But it's a great pleasure to join this panel, and it's a great honor to listen to your very inspiring and heartbreaking story at the same time. Let me just outline a couple of observations to your question at the beginning, like how did we get here? And let me actually broaden the lens a little bit and not just talk about human rights, but democracy and rule of law writ large, of course, encompassing human rights as well. We are approaching next year the 20th anniversary of the Big Bang accession, the Central and Eastern European countries joining the European Union in 2004. And I think it's a great time to do a stock taking. It's a great time to look at what went right, but also what went wrong. And as I was preparing for this panel, as I was thinking about these questions, of course, the reasons are incredibly complex why we are talking about democratic backsliding throughout the region pretty much, and particularly in Poland and Hungary and to some extent Slovakia potentially as well. I outlined 4 reasons. There are many more, but I think it's helpful to just start the discussion around these 4. One, we clearly underestimated what I call the shallowness of the roots of democratic traditions and institutions, that amidst the turbulence of the 19th and the 20th century, democratic traditions and institutions never really had the time or the space to take hold or take deep roots in these countries. So that's one. 2, we clearly were wrong assuming that once these countries join the European Union, there will be no turning back. And once the conditionality, the Copenhagen criteria conditionality went away, it was clear that the democratic backsliding already started because these external conditions were not there. 3, after the EU and NATO accession, I would argue that we underestimated how geopolitically contested this region will remain. So we kind of felt that we are in safe waters now, we are within the community, our security and our safety and our freedoms and democracy are guaranteed by these international institutions and our membership in them. And we underestimated the ambition of outside actors like Russia, like China, to play in Central and Eastern Europe in a big way. And last but not least, and this is probably the most controversial, and I mean this as self-criticism as well, is that I've seen this movie too many times in Hungary, in Poland as well, that these authoritarian leaders very often take a page out of the János Kádár playbook, live and let live. So as long as you don't overtly become political and antagonistic to the very system, then your cosmopolitan bubble life will remain untouched, at least for the time being. So that created a situation whereby there is a level of laziness is probably a little too strong, but the sense of danger is not prevalent enough so that enough people push back because you don't feel that you are on your individual day-to-day level, at least in EU member states, are affected by this. But it's coming, and it's like the frog being boiled in gradually heating water. So that's the force. So more importantly, I guess, what can we do about it? And I outlined just 3 broad areas of action. The first directly pertaining to what Action for Democracy does, which is a relatively new organization based in the US. Essentially, the theory of change behind Action for Democracy is how do we create grassroots solidarity to push back against authoritarianism? And how do we tap into the untapped potential of the masses? How do we tap into the untapped potential of ordinary citizens who are concerned about not just democratic backsliding in Poland or Hungary, but they are also understanding that this is part of a big picture, and if someone from Hungary or someone from the United States can help a civil society organization in Poland or in one of the other what we call battleground states, then they will help their cause ultimately in their home country as well. So what we are trying to do is to tap into that potential and portray this struggle as a global struggle, and create a global network of what we call freedom funders on the grassroots level, thousands or tens of thousands, ideally hundreds of thousands of people eventually, who would like to chip in to this fight and who would like to support frontline organizations in Hungary, in Poland, in Venezuela, in Cambodia, in many other places around the world. So we are global in that sense. And then there is one particular segment that we are focusing on is diasporas, and how we activate diasporas like the Polish diaspora in the US or in Western Europe, or the Hungarian diaspora. Many other diasporas are observing what's happening in their home country with increasing alarm, but they don't really have frictionless means to help or to support frontline organizations. Very often they don't really have the knowledge to know which organizations are worth supporting. They don't have the opportunity to donate easily. We are creating that bridge between those communities and their home countries and the frontline organizations. So that's one. 2, EU and the US. As I mentioned, the EU has been waking up finally to this challenge, and the introduction of the rule of law mechanism and new mechanisms within the European Union to be able to clamp down on these egregious democracy and human rights and rule of law violations are helpful. I think we should proceed more expeditiously into that direction and create these criteria and conditionality once you become a member that should apply, and that should be harsh and that should be stringent from that perspective. And I would argue, ironically, because I'm being accused in Hungary as being a CIA agent trying to foment dissent and topple the government, ironically, part of the reason why we established Action for Democracy is that we have seen that the US government is actually not doing enough in the region. They are not supporting enough civil society organizations. They are not as robust as they used to be in the 1990s. They, in many ways, believe that because these countries belong to the EU now, they could move on to other areas of the world. I would argue that it would be paramount so that the US is also more robustly returning to this scene and supporting civil society organizations. And last but not least, and to close it off, I fundamentally believe, and this is what Freedom Games and Turning Point very much is about, and we are very proud to support them for that. I think, how do we redefine democracy so that it resonates with and delivers for the younger generations? And that's going to be the absolutely critical struggle in the next decades. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. My next question I would like to address to Piotr. Piotr is going to speak in Polish, so if you need translation, do you take a translation kit? Piotr is an expert in minority rights. And could you describe what has been happening in terms of minority rights protection? And before the event, we had a discussion that the very narrative, human rights narrative, should change. What exactly do you mean? Could you please reflect upon this?
Kiedy obserwujemy,
when we look at how human rights are presented, the concept of human rights today, it's focused on a form of threat to national values, a threat to independence, sovereignty of the country. Very often by us as activists, human rights are presented only in one context, as ethnic minorities, national minorities, LGBT. Also, the issue of the fight for climate and ecology, the environment. We are often in bubbles. We often present human rights ourselves in the context of certain obligations arising from international treaties, because the European Union obligates Poland and Hungary to do something. So all the time this concept appears as being external. And indeed we need a grassroots level action, as David mentioned. Indeed, we need to change our approach. We need to understand it's the need arising from all of us, a grassroots thing. It's associated with the needs of all residents of our region. This is crucial, very important. When we look at certain mechanisms related to minorities, for example, anti-Semitism in the Visegrad region. Indeed, right now, it is not a tool to attack the Jewish community. It's a tool for polarization. It's a tool used by politicians to attack liberal politicians or by third parties. So again, it's difficult to counteract this because we're not really talking about protecting minorities. Indeed, counteracting discrimination is, phobia. We can say, okay, this is not targeted at a given minority directly, and so we do not undertake action. So again, we talk about some ideas, a concept of human rights developed in the West and has come here. So what is important, what we are promoting in terms of minority rights is events such as Freedom Games, where different groups from different bubbles can meet one another, can talk at a meta level about human rights. We are promoting this in the European Union as well. Projects in which within one project we can talk about remembrance, xenophobia, climate, Shoah. So we combine all of that, and that's how we can arise to a higher level, to this meta level. It's a completely different story. Rather than talking about human rights within a one bubble, one group, in excluding other groups. Okay, we say, okay, human rights concern only this group, not myself. I think it's one of the major challenges, educational challenges.
Piotr, I would like to address Erik. Erik, in your contribution to our publication, you specifically touched the problem of disinformation. Could you please describe what you find as the most pressing issue, human rights issue in Hungary, and what you see as the problem that needs to be tackled now?
Thank you. So actually my approach, I think it's very similar than David approach, maybe because we are coming from the same country. And in connection with Hungary, I would say three points which are very similar to yours. The first one is that this democratic development is not a one-way road. And actually I think that was a kind of common misunderstanding after the 2004 EU enlargement, that once a member state is part of the club, then that member state will always respect the rules. And it just came out that this is not the case, this is not the situation. And sometimes we are just talking about Hungary and Poland Poland, but also there are some other member states with warning signs. So there isn't any guarantee that more member states will be not joined to this kind of illiberal countries. So I think this myth, what we have to face with for the first time, that this is not just a one-way road and there's no U-turn in this development or in this process. The second thing, what I wanted to say, that these autocrats can learn from each other. So if you remember last year, together with the Hungarian parliamentary elections, there was a referendum, a so-called child protection referendum. This referendum was everything about just not child protection. And here in Poland, in 1 month, there will be a parliamentary elections with a referendum, also with manipulated questions, just in order to use as a mobilization tool in favor of the ruling party. And the third thing, what I wanted to say, that Rome wasn't built in a day, and this Orban's or Kaczynski's illiberal state wasn't built in a day either. So Orban returned to the power in 2010, and I finished my university studies just 1 year later. So I've spent all of my legal career under the Orban regime. So it was quite visible, or it was possible to see this process in Hungary, how this illiberal regime was built. And actually, I think here we should also emphasize the role of the international community, the EU institutions, also the role of the United States, the NGOs, the political parties, and everything. And I have this kind of metaphor that for a very long time Orban was seen as that uncle who is eating at the table with a bit loud, but we accept his role because he is our uncle, he is also part of the family. Okay, maybe it's a bit disgusting the way how he is eating, but he's still at the table. And actually just a few years ago, when for example the EU institutions realized that it's not possible to finance, for example, this illiberal regime in Hungary, and in this publication, taking into consideration the limits of the land, I've tried to summarize the recent developments. Obviously, it's quite impossible to summarize everything in 10 pages, and one of the things what I wanted to highlight is the disinformation and how the Hungarian state media, we cannot call it anymore, it's a public broadcaster because this is a partly driven and state-controlled media, how this media is used as the Kremlin's horse and just echoing the Kremlin's narrative and propaganda related to Ukraine, the Baltics, the EU, Brussels, and so on and so forth. So I think it's quite a unique phenomena in Hungary that the state media is used as a propaganda channel, a propaganda tool, in order to echoing the Kremlin's messages.
I didn't mention Russia intentionally, even though I work for Russia in Exile office, and it would appear somehow in the conversation. My question would be, so you all have identified EU member countries that have problems in human rights situation and that need to be addressed. And you have identified human rights problems that exist in countries like Belarus or, for example, Russia. Belarus is not part of any European structure. So if you and Russia actually left all the European structures, and this is a problem. So and there are still people to be protected in these countries. And it's not that there is nobody living there and nobody struggling. People continue their struggle. And they need support, but how do you support them if they cannot address European institutions? So this is a question for all of you, not only Franak. Maybe Franak could relate to Belarus as a Belarusian, but who would like to start?
I can start with Belarus. So yes, we as Belarus are not part of international institutions because Lukashenko was seeing the threat in being part of them. But we are still part of OSCE, which basically is paralyzed right now because Russia is blocking Estonian presidency on OSCE, and OSCE cannot take any decision because it needs consensus. And second is UN, and United Nations could play a much bigger role. And here I speak not just about UN Human Rights Council, but also UN Security Council. Human rights is also today part of the security issues. Very often they are interconnected. There will be UNGA next week starting, and we will see how many leaders will address human rights. And that will be very important sign for us. Are we on a good track? Because last year it was almost forgotten. It was not on the agenda at all in New York. In Lukashenko, when he came to power 30 years ago, he destroyed all the institutions and he stopped any efforts for Belarus to join Rome Statute and ICC, which basically prevented him from being dragged to tribunal, dragged to accountability for his crimes. And now recently he denied or cancelled Belarus signature under optional protocol on defense of human rights, which basically allows Belarusians to address European human rights courts. And now when you're in Belarus, when you're in jail for 20-25 years, I have so many friends who are 20 plus years old, 20 plus years sentenced, who cannot appeal anywhere. So the Lukashenko's trial is a final destination for them. There is no any way. And I think what can be done here, for example, European human rights courts, they can still accept complaints from Belarusians. Lukashenko withdrawn Belarus from Eastern Partnership, which also has human rights component. But the European Partnership can still accept Belarusians for the program. We have legitimate leaders, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who won elections. Of course, she is treated as a president by most of European countries, but formalization of this relationship is not yet there. So we tried right now, for example, a very ambitious project. Lukashenko last week, he signed a decree basically prohibiting Belarusians from getting passports abroad or any legal documents, which make potentially 500,000 Belarusians stateless persons. Now kids are born on the EU territory and they're stateless. They cannot receive either Belarusian passport or the passports of the country they were born. And we plan to issue our own passports. It's ambitious, but that will be also test how international community can act in such non-conventional situations. So these passports will confirm the citizenship of Belarus for these people and will give them some legal status in the country they're now.
Would you like to relate to this?
So when it comes to the toolkit, maybe just one issue, which is sanctions. And the US in particular, but also the EU to some limited extent, has the weaponry to sanction human rights violators in a much more robust fashion. I think the US has started doing that based on the Magnitsky Act. I think there is still space to grow and room to ramp that up. Not expecting a miracle from that, and in the short run it may even make things worse, but in the medium and long term I expect sanctions to affect the behavior of some of these bad actors. So I would very much put that on the table.
And then you mentioned working with diasporas. Do you think there is any potential in supporting, for example, Belarusian diaspora abroad?
Yes, and actually we need to have a conversation about that. By all means, and again, coming back to this point, so there are huge diasporas, including Belarusians. It's very hard to organize them because very often we don't know where they are, especially when it comes to recent diasporas, first-generation diasporas, people who moved after the EU accession, for example, from Poland and Hungary. It's difficult, although not impossible, through digital means to find these people and organize them. In the US, it's slightly different because some of those diasporas tend to be politically more conservative or less attuned to the home country issues, but there is a significant chunk there as well to build upon. So what we are really trying to do is to put it together in a way that we can find individual diaspora members from Poland, from Belarus, from Hungary, etc. But also, once we build the community around support for the home country, also to activate them so that it's not just Poles supporting Polish organizations, but also Hungarian supporting or Hungarian Americans supporting Polish organizations, because again, coming back to the point, we are all in this together, and these are all big pieces of the domino, and once one falls, then the rest will follow.
Okay. You have all mentioned human rights education and the importance of education. What do you think we need to educate about? What should be the focus?
Well, before answering this question, I just wanted to add one thing, because here in this panel we are also representing at least 3 different countries, and what I've experienced, for example, when I was with my colleagues with talking donor organizations or other institutions, that we have to understand the situation in a country in its context. So what I've experienced during the last decade is that we will, and with all due respect, obviously we will always find a country which is in a worse situation. So if we compare Poland, Hungary and Belarus, then obviously Belarus is in a worse situation. But if we compare Belarus and another country, then this other country will be. So we will always find a country which is in a worse situation in terms of human rights and so on and so forth. But it doesn't mean that the situation in a specific country is not that serious. So for example, when just after Orban returned to the power and the 2 new media acts were accepted and acted in Hungary, then there was this general understanding, but okay, but the journalists are not killed on the streets of Hungary. Yeah, that's true, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the freedom of speech and expression and freedom of media is a lively thing in the country. So we have to understand the context of each country in its context, and obviously in a broader European or in international context. And I think that was also a kind of misunderstanding of the donor organizations when they tend to support other organizations in other countries, and they just forget, for example, Central Europe. And back to the question related to the education, I'm not an education expert, so what I can say is just that obviously it has a long-term effect. So, for example, I strongly believe in media literacy, which is very close to my heart. But obviously the problem is hic et nunc, so we have to address these challenges right now, because media literacy is definitely a very important thing, but it has an effect in 10 years' time. So I don't want to challenge the role of the education, which is super important, but it's rather a medium or a long-term aim, and we have to address the human rights issues, for example, right now. So I think it should be part of the longer-term thinking, but it has effect just in a longer term.
Franak, David, Piotr, would you like to relate to this? What should we educate about?
So sądzę, że powinniśmy.
I believe we should focus on education because when it comes to the mechanisms, well, on the one hand, I would agree that EU mechanisms are important, that they respond to the situation. But when, my background is science and technology, so if we look at the budget allocations at the UN and the EU, and we look at the human rights budget, we can see that this budget is not as strong and big as it should be. It's the smallest allocation usually, and I do encourage you also at the UN TV. You can see UPR from Iran. You can see the discussion during such an event. Discussions taking place during this event. It's a very specific language, and it seems on the face of it that everything is fine. And the same can be said about Poland and Hungary. There are recommendations. Countries agree with them. But what happens next? Well, these recommendations are important, but this is a kind of quick response, quick political response with the time horizon of several years, but education and networking. And speaking of the diaspora, I think that Poland is a very good example of the growth of civil society after the fall of the Berlin Wall. When in the early 1990s, many activists, many people who wanted to get engaged in the civil rights movement, and they were invited to France, the UK, the United States. They were trained, they got some practice, they were educated as activists, but networking was very important because they could create internet and develop international networks. Well, today many of them are directors of NGOs in Poland, or they work in diplomacy, so they can shape certain behavior. They draw from these international contacts and relations that they established at that time. And I think that Poland can cooperate with Belarusian, Ukrainian activists and developing strong networks when change occurs. That gives the potential, the foundations for the rebuilding or reconstructing the foundations for democracy and human rights. But again, education, and Poland is a counter or a negative example when it comes to education, where after the first term of the conservative rule in Poland, liberals took over, or some called them liberals, that was the civic platform, but nothing changed in education. Education continued promoting xenophobic attitudes and this threats to sovereignty, saying that the anti-Semitism is there only because of migrants from Syria, that's the source. And the effect could be seen in 2015 when society left without proper education, also in the field of human rights, made their choice. In Hungary, there was a study on how much people are ready to give up some aspects of independence and freedom for some benefits in return. And 25% of Hungarian society said, yes, we are ready to do that. We are ready to give up some of our freedoms and independence for good governance. But good government is a government that doesn't restrict human rights. And again, education. And in education, I'd like to draw your attention to one very important thing that happened, I think, before the pandemic. That was the UN report on genocide of one of the groups, ethnic groups in Asia, where attention was drawn to the responsibility of Facebook. That report was important because it was the first report where the UN stated that Meta, today's Meta, was engaged and supported this genocide. So I think we should start looking at social media also from this point of view as bubbles which have to decide whether we work for the democratic society and we shape it, or do we go for a business model. There is an organization in the UK which draws attention to the fact that the business model of printed media, especially targeting the working class, that they are based on hate, that they incite to hatred. So we should break away with this vicious circle. There we can see these external forces from Russia, which impact elections in other countries in Europe. So, and of course, this national perspective is very important, but education to me is the key.
Can I just add one quick thing to the education piece? So what I also believe, coming back to that point about how do we engage younger generations, but not only younger generations, is the choice of format and the choice of medium. And very often we tend to go back to try it and test it, but not very impactful, still old formats. And I would encourage us to look at interactive storytelling, powerful multimedia narratives. Games in particular have been incredibly effective and wide-reaching and impactful. Social impact gaming is a rising field, so that's something that I would definitely look into as it has huge potential in education, human rights, and democracy.
Also wanted to say about games, but also films, movies, documentaries. Netflix is a powerful tool when people can watch international documentaries about human rights situation in other countries. Suddenly Belarusians found out that where there was like Rwanda's genocide, there was Cambodians, Red Khmers, and people were writing comments, wow, it's about Belarus. And they found parallels, and they start to think that something wrong is their country. Yesterday I watched the interview of a Belarusian influencer, a very popular blogger, and he said, I was always for Lukashenko until I read the book, just a mass popular book about death squads of Lukashenko. It was very written in simple, popular manner, how Lukashenko was killing his opponents in 1999. Just gave him weapons and said, take these people to forest, kill them and put them, bury them. And he said, after that, I spoke to each of my friends and convinced them that something is going on. And that's also part of this human rights, if I may, education.
Yeah, just one very short thing, which is, I think, one of the biggest challenges in Hungary, at least, that the democracy won't be operating and won't be working without Democrats. So I think that was also a kind of misunderstanding for a long time, that the democracy was built, and okay, it was not a perfect building, but it was possible to move in, it was possible to live in, and then after 2010 we just seen that this building could collapse very, very quickly without any significant obstacle, and this is the answer back to the question, that this is the role, or this is the sense of the education, that how this future generation with the democratic and, from my perspective, liberal attitudes will be educated, will be learned.
I would like to mention one thing. I think it's that example in the V4 country. We have some new collaboration on the level of the local authority. So between the cities and capitals, like this is the agreement between the Budapest, Warsaw, Prague, and Bratislava, according to democracy rules and human rights issues. So I think it's because we always on some national level we focus on the national authority, but we have a local authority, and even EU recognizes now local authority like one of the pillar for the cooperation, and they would like to support them directly, not by the government. And this is some kind of trick when they start they would like to start cooperation with the different cooperation between Poland and Hungary. They use the local authority. So I think it's but it's Franka mentioned about the different stakeholders. It's not only the national, but the local authority, and so we need to think broadly and think strategy, like a long and short-term tactic.
Thank you so much. We have just 8 minutes left, and the organizers are very strict about time. So let's sum up so that the audience leaves this discussion with a clear message. And I would like to come back to the question, what should be done? So could you conclude with 2 or 3 sentences? What should be done right now to improve the human rights situation in your country and globally?
Well, it's a very easy question to answer in a minute. So I would rather say something from the perspective of a Hungarian NGO, what I think could be useful. And for example, when we have a meeting with a donor organization, with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, or with someone else, I always emphasize that it's not just everything about grants and money, but also about network, connections, relationships, and contacts. So I think these organizations can help for a Hungarian NGO also with this. So for example, to find a partner for a Horizon project, which is sometimes more challenging than we originally think. And the other thing, I think this is also important from our perspective, to learn and to be ready for innovative solutions, new ideas, new solutions, and not just repeating those patterns what we inherited from the past. So, for example, what David mentioned is gaming. It's just a new initiative. It's just a new idea. What we have to learn, for example. Thank you.
We have to fight fatigue. Not only among ourselves, but among societies and populations. Fatigue about Ukraine, fatigue about Belarus, fatigue about human rights. Because when we repeat all the time about political prisoner, today I wear a T-shirt with Ales Beliatsky portrait. It's his second sentence in his life. He's a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. He's a good friend of us who saved thousands of people from prison. Now he is tortured. He is in communicado mode. His family didn't receive any messages from him for months. Same as Svetlana Stikhanovskaya, husband, and many, many others. But we don't see these stories anymore because they're repetitive, media are not interested. Ourselves, we already tired of speaking about political prisoners. So I encourage all of us to force ourselves each morning to do something good for democracy, human rights, for political prisoners in Belarus, for Ukrainian heroes fighting for European freedom as well. That's something we should, why we should be disciplined. And I want to finish on a positive note, that all dictators are collapsing. And I look very positively in the future. In 2020, before our revolution has started, I was giving an interview in June, 2 months before the revolution. Nothing will happen. There will not be protests. Repressions are so high, and suddenly millions on the streets of 30 cities in Belarus. Same will happen with Putin, with Lukashenko, with other dictators. But when it happens, it depends on us. And in order this happens soon, we need to preserve structures, institutions, and the energy of the people. And I speak about ourselves. We try to strengthen our institutions right now. Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya built the cabinet, coordination council, this network of NGOs. So when the right moment comes, and this house of cards of Lukashenko will start collapsing, we will have viable institutions that will not allow new dictatorship to come. So this is our goal right now when we can't protest openly, at least to make sure when moment opens, we will not lose it.
Let me just echo what Piotr was talking about, which is creating a more direct relationship between the EU and local authorities, but also NGOs and other players. I think particularly in the context of the rule of law mechanism and withholding funding from misbehaving governments, which proved to be or is proving to be quite an effective tool. But that gives the political weapon to these authoritarian leaders, saying that the EU is punishing them, and ultimately could lead to a situation whereby EU relations with these national governments will become even more complicated, pushing them maybe towards the exit at some point. So creating that direct linkage and the ability to channel funds to local authorities, it's not just a democracy and human rights, but it's also an efficiency issue. I mean, very often cities are at the front lines of fighting climate change, the digital transition. So when you look at the EU agenda, EU policies, they would be a lot more effective if the EU had more channels and legal avenues to channel funding for these actors locally.
So I think the one word towards joint action. I think this is important to work together, like create kind of networking between everyone. Sometimes it's possible, but we need to put on the meta level our challenge or our needs. Yeah, because we focus sometimes only even we spoke about some human rights, we focus only one specific group. So, and this it's some kind of barrier to cooperate with the other groups. Yeah, but we need to start to organize joint action.
Thank you so much, Erik, Franak, David, and Piotr. I have 2 minutes to conclude. And yesterday we had a discussion with Ute, our director, and Sebastian about what should be the message of this discussion and how do I moderate a discussion with people from so many different backgrounds, because we come from different countries and it's not that easy to draw parallels between different national backgrounds. And what Sebastian told me, you need to focus on communication, because for liberals, communication is the key, and we need to communicate with each other, and we need to learn from each other. And I hope that this happened today. Thank you so much. Thank you to the audience. Yeah, and I can conclude the discussion.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it and how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Dzień dobry, to znaczy myśmy się dzisiaj widzieli. Wie pan co, ja zmieniłem zdanie i chciałbym poprawić. Karty w urnie. Dobrze? To ja sobie poszukam.
Serio? Pan sobie poszuka? Nadchodzące wybory są zbyt ważne, by zostawić je bez kontroli. Dołącz do obywatelskiej kontroli wyborów. Zróbmy wybory bez PiS-u.
Jestem z zawodu lekarzem. Zajmowałam się diagnostyką chorób nowotworowych.
W Białorusi zajmowałam się mikrobiologią i molekularną biologią.
Byłem nauczycielem szkoły podstawowej.
Naszym celem jest budowanie umiejętności, które są ważne na polskim rynku pracy.
Szybko nabierają takiej pewności siebie, bardzo szybko się uczą.
Wszystko możliwe, kiedy starasz się.
Każdy wybór ma swoje konsekwencje.
Dziś na kazaniu o takich jak ty mówili, że to morderczynie.
A wiesz, że ta, która ci pomogła, trafi za kraty?
Trzeba mieć sumienie.
Jak mogłaś to zrobić własnej matce?
Aborcja to najgorsza zbrodnia.
Gdybym ja podjęła taką decyzję, nie byłoby cię tutaj.
Organy państwa nie będą przyglądać się temu obojętnie.
Życie i zdrowie kobiety jest najważniejsze.
Stop kryminalizacji aborcji.
Kobieta decyduje.